glad to see so many people here for this discussion. I'm Emily Roller. I'm a Yale College alum, Berkeley '07. I'm a writer and a librettist, primarily for opera these days, and I'm one of the 9 co-founders of Midnight Oil Collective. We are very excited to host this conversation tonight with Yale Sci-City. Sci-City is an organization that really helped us as a company find our direction and launch. So it's really exciting now to be in partnership for this workshop. So thank you. We're also very grateful to our university partners at Michigan and Peabody who helped us spread the word and who have representatives who will be participating in this conversation with us as panelists. And yeah, as you mentioned, I'm going to be giving a short introduction just to sort of like prime discussion, and then my co-founders Francis Pollock and Edwin Joseph are going to introduce our panelists, moderate the discussion. Hopefully there's going to be plenty of time left at the end to field some questions. So yeah, here we go. The title of this workshop is Recasting the Artist as Entrepreneur. And this is a topic that we at Midnight Oil Collective have been discussing somewhat incessantly for 2 years with pretty much anybody who will talk to us about it. So I'm expecting this to be a fruitful panel, fruitful day. So let's dive in. Okay. So before getting to the idea of entrepreneurship, which will be the focus of the panel, I actually want to start off talking about equity. I mean, of course I do, right? Here we are in 2022, and discussions about equity and diversity and inclusion are happening across campuses, workplaces, and households around the country. There are panels and lectures and books and TED Talks, and I think that's a good thing. We have identified examples of inequity and exclusion across the nation. We've witnessed its repercussions in heartbreaking and tragic examples of violence and brutality. And we're slowly starting to recognize the impact of its more insidious everyday expressions, especially those that impact people in their places of work. One thing, though, that always seems to be missing from these conversations is a full exploration of the definition of the word equity. In the arts and humanities, we tend to define equity as a type of fairness that contrasts with equality, right? We've all seen the different memes, the people riding bicycles, the 3 people looking over a fence at a baseball game, this one of people picking apples. And they're all trying to communicate the same basic idea, right? Equity doesn't mean giving everybody the same thing, right? The same height of stools here. It means giving everybody what they need to participate. And I'm guessing that some version of this explanation sounds very familiar to everyone here, especially my fellow artists. And I'm sure many of us even have our favorite preferences of illustrations that demonstrate it. But I'm not sure how we in the arts and humanities have so firmly settled on this definition of fairness. Because in the business and investment world, equity means something a little bit different. Equity means ownership. So when people hold equity in a business, it means they own part of a business, right? Companies, for instance, can be owned by 1 individual, 2 individuals, or corporations can even be divided up and owned by millions of individuals. The part of the corporation that you own is called a share. And if you own a share, it means you have equity. You own part of the company. Equity then, in a business or an investment sense, has nothing to do with making working conditions fair. The business definition is not about who gets to pick the apples, right? The business definition is about who, at the end of the day, owns the apples. Equity means ownership. So it's hard for me to imagine a truly equitable arts industry until we start paying more attention to who owns our work. Now, many creators, especially our composers, playwrights, screenwriters, will quickly argue, I do own my work. I create something and I own the copyright. Why do I need to consider ownership? And you're correct. You do own the copyright to your scores, your plays, your scripts. But what happens when you want your opera or play or movie to be made? We have to consider what happens when a work goes into production. So disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. You should definitely not take legal advice from me. But you should take my advice to seek legal advice before going into production. We have had conversations with lawyers about how so many producers and studios in our field are actively working against artists' interests. In film or TV, for instance, it is industry standard to come up with a brilliant idea and then immediately sell the copyright in its entirety to a studio, just like that. You have no right to the idea, to this idea that might eventually make the network millions of dollars. Can you imagine for a second if tech worked this way? If someone came along to Zuckerberg and was like, great Facebook idea, man, I'll just take that off your hands and produce it for you. If it worked like TV, Zuckerberg would be written a $200,000 check, would hand over the rights, and would then have to start developing his next coding idea while somebody else implemented Facebook. Can you imagine that? But artists who retain the copyright to their work, which are arrangements common in theater and opera, also don't necessarily have as much ownership as we believe. While owning the copyright may give the holder the opportunity to license the work to others, it is very common for the original writers or composers to have no say in the actual production of their work. They get a royalty, but they rarely get a voice in how the piece is cast. They don't have a say in the direction or the marketing, and they certainly don't have a say in the scope of the piece. One anecdote to illustrate the limitations on licensing is when my wife licensed her opera to be performed at a new music festival, they put her opera in an old movie theater with just horrible acoustics. And we had to sit there pretending that the music sounded good, even when we couldn't hear half of it. So my point is that having ownership over the copyright does not equate to having true ownership over the production itself. In a way, it's a little bit like owning the business plan, but not the business. And once you give up ownership, you give up power. And more importantly, you give up some agency. So I'm not here to say that all producers or producing organizations are bad, or that good art can never come out of the system. I'm just saying that when you give up your agency, you are giving somebody else the power to shape your vision. So let's return to the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you're an artist who cares about these things, giving up the ownership means you're giving up your power to shape your work's implementation. When you give up ownership, you don't have a say in how the production is made. You don't have a say in how much your colleagues are paid. You don't have a choice in casting or company culture or how things are used to promote alternative agendas. You've contractually given up the right to have a voice in the production process. And let me tell you from experience, there is nothing more frustrating than watching people, your collaborators, feel used or mistreated while working on a piece that you helped create, when you have no actual power to enact change. Yes, of course, you can advocate, but you're not the one who gets to make the decision. But let's also be very clear, equity is more than decision-making power. It also amounts to extraordinary economic power. And to illustrate this, let me use an example from the arts.
Bobby, put some clothes on, goddamn.
From the arts adjacent world of sports. Let's talk about Michael Jordan. So hang with me here. All right. Michael Jordan, shooting guard for the Chicago Bulls in the 80s and 90s, made $90 million in salary over the course of his career. That's not bad, right? I mean, becoming the best basketball player in the world is incredibly difficult, and his work ethic is definitely legendary, but $90 million seems very, very comfortable. But that's not where he made the money that has led him to have a net worth of $1.7 billion. He made that through royalties. Most of us are probably familiar with Air Jordans. This is Michael Jordan's shoe collaboration with Nike. Jordan receives a 5% royalty on every pair of Air Jordans sold, sort of in the same way that a writer or composer might receive a royalty. Air Jordans have been making something to the tune of $4.7 billion a year. That's what they made in 2021, which means that Michael Jordan raked in something along the lines of $235 million in 1 year. In other words, Michael Jordan made more than 2.5 times what he made in his entire career playing basketball from 1 year of footwear royalties. So keep in mind, of course, Michael Jordan doesn't have a say in how those shoes were made, right? At least to my knowledge, he doesn't hold equity in Nike itself, but he does financially participate because he licenses them the right to use his name and image. And this license can carry significantly more economic value than his basketball salary did. But let's look at the person who holds the most economic power in this situation, which is Phil Knight. So I'm gonna pop on over to Forbes for just a second. Okay, Phil Knight, founder of Nike, was worth $49.9 billion as of 2021. He and his family hold about a 24% stake in Nike. So this chart shows his net worth growth, right, over the past 5 years or so. And you can see between 2020 and 2021, there's actually a $20 billion growth in his net worth. Now, that's not because he had a big salary increase, right? He was in fact retired, as you can see up here, as of 2016. That's from his stake in Nike. That's not only 85 times the amount that Michael Jordan made from the Air Jordans that year. It's 10 times Michael Jordan's entire net worth that Phil Knight made in 1 year from his equity stake in Nike. And of course, this was an unusual year. You can see other years he usually just increases his wealth by $3 to $4 billion, but that's still 1.5 or 2 times Michael Jordan's net worth every single year that he makes from his equity holdings. When we say that equity can bring significantly more economic power than salary, this is what we're talking about. And I think it's worth a quick scroll back up through this Forbes list to see how many people on it have actually gotten wealthy from large salaries, right? Do we see movie stars who get, millions of dollars a picture, pop stars, people we often think of as rich? And the answer is zero. We can scroll up the list, we can scroll down the list, a long, long, long way before we find somebody who generated their wealth primarily from salaries. I've actually never gotten far enough to find that person. I don't even know if they exist on this list at all. As a point of reference, Michael Jordan is 1,931 on the 2021 Forbes list, and we still wouldn't say that he made his wealth from salary, right? So for the most part, it's kind of interesting, right? Because we don't picture the folks on this list in our minds when we think about power. Maybe we think about political figures or celebrities, maybe in our field. And it's true that the people at the very top of this list are celebrities of sorts, right? They're kind of famous for being rich or shooting themselves off into space, or really they're famous for the companies that they started, right? So Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Google. But the majority of these people you probably wouldn't recognize on the street, and yet they are the people who hold the most economic power in the world. And that economic power, which is real power, comes primarily from equity. Okay, so it might be tempting to say, look, I don't care about being rich. I'm motivated by other things, like creating art. I could be completely comfortable performing on Michael Jordan's $90 million salary, even without the shoe deal. Okay, of course, sure, me too. But the odds of becoming Michael Jordan famous and compensated as such are, of course, very low. And the same is true of becoming a movie star who is compensated with a high salary, or even a relatively famous artist. And if you're not famous, even if you're lucky enough to have work, your salary is going to be much closer to the starting salary of somebody selling the shoes at Foot Locker for $35,000 a year. And please understand that I do not say this dismissively either of the working artist or the worker at Foot Locker. I mean, real talk, I've been in this field for 15 years, and unless you count my arts-related teaching salaries, I've never made more than $5,250 in a single year from my artistic work. I have, however, worked 11 part-time jobs, 4 full-time jobs in that time frame. But $35,000, if I made that from my art alone, that would be a banner year for me. I also want to say that I'm not pointing out these numbers because I'm in awe of billionaires or because I even have an aspiration to be one myself. On the contrary, all I want to do is show how much of a difference equity makes, particularly when a great idea reaches a wide audience. This is as true for art as it is for footwear. In fact, the market for art is almost 10 times the market for footwear. So I want to suggest that these numbers should be on our minds when we think about diversity and equity and inclusion, because we are talking about amounts of money here that could be game-changing for entire communities, that could support an entire creative ecosystem, that could open pathways for art that include broader, more diverse artists and audiences, if we wisely invest and if more people hold equity. So let's return to our 2 definitions of equity. Can we truly have an equitable world based in fairness if we do not have equitable ownership? Can we truly have fairness if people who help create a project do not participate in the decision-making or the upside? How might equity, as in ownership, be a tool to help us achieve true equity, as in fairness? How might sharing equity help align interests across the whole creative ecosystem, from investors to producers to writers to composers to performers? How might it help provide all of us with what we need to thrive? In my mind, structural change in our field and our production pathways starts with rethinking equity, but it doesn't end there. We need to get curious about models for innovation, models for funding, supporting, and growing projects, perhaps looking outside our field for inspiration. The current art pathways are not efficient, and they're not supporting artists. Enough waiting for a break, hoping to beat the odds, or trying to attract an established champion for our work. We can look to our immediate communities to find people to collaborate with. And we are creative. We can forge new pathways together. We just need a willingness to engage and experiment with the business side of projects. So in this panel to follow, we're going to hear from several professionals who are willing to share their experiences with traditional career pathways in the arts and to think very creatively with us about the business side of this industry. And it's my hope that this conversation will lead to conversations within your communities, and that those conversations will lead to collaborations. Because when we collaborate, we can affect real change. And this field needs to change. It has major problems. So it's time to think a bit more like entrepreneurs and turn those problems into opportunity. It's time to take ownership, not just of the content of our work, but of production. And it's time to ensure that that ownership is shared equitably. Okay, so Francis, Edwin, I'm going to turn things over to you now so you can introduce our guests and really kick off this panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. That was a lot of really good food for thought, and I'm sure we will dive deep into these 2 definitions of equity and the places that they intersect. I am thrilled to be the person who is announcing this panel. This panel is made up of friends and colleagues and trusted advisors and mentors. First on the panel, we have Maurice Harris. Maurice is the Director of Marketing and Communications at the Yale Schwartzman Center. He is a co-founder and the co-president of 5015 Records, and he is a fellow MOC Accelerating Artist. Dr. Albert Lee is the Director of Equity, Belonging, and Student Life. He is Associate Professor of Music at the Yale School of Music, my music, and he is a trusted confidant of mine. Kay Shepard is a lecturer of professional studies and a manager of community partnerships at Peabody, at the Peabody Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. And Jonathan Kaluski is the director of the Excel Lab at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. Thank y'all so much for joining us today on this panel. All right, before we dive into these stickier questions of equity, I want to give this fabulous group of people a chance to get you to know you outside of your LinkedIn profiles. So I was wondering if we could just go around the room and we could all talk about who we are and how we got artistically where we are today. And I'm just looking at Albert. I was hoping that we could just start with you.
Fine, I will start. Hi, everybody. Francis introduced me so you know what my current position is, but I started singing. I'm a singer, first and foremost. I started singing in church as a child, sang all the way through grade school, went to the University of Connecticut in my home state. I'm actually from New Haven, Connecticut originally. Went to Juilliard for a master's, spent 8 years out singing full time, and during that time was doing a bit of teaching. When the economy tanked back in 2008, I decided to go back to school and did a doctorate at Florida State. Spent 9 years at a university in Nevada, and now I've just started at Yale in August. So I still sing professionally. As soon as we finish this panel, I've got music in the other room that I've got to start working on for rehearsal next week with Vegas Opera. So still busy.
Fantastic. Kay, do you mind if we could get over to you?
Yeah, thank
all
you.
right.
It looks like I can unmute for a second. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Kay Shepard. My name is actually Candea, but I also go by Kay. I am a steel pan musician. And I grew up, was born in Trinidad and Tobago, and I also grew up in Baltimore from the age of around 9. So I kind of have dual experiences. Traversing here to Peabody was kind of a long-winded thing, but I actually went to Berklee College of Music is where I got my bachelor's in music business management. I also had a minor in Africana Studies, Music and Society. Then I went ahead and got a post-bac in music entrepreneurship, which has led me to kind of this adventure here that we're talking about today. And I also, previously to this, I worked, Francis knows me from the ORCIDS, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra's ORCIDS program, where I worked through being an intern all the way up to a senior program manager prior to coming over to my position here at Peabody. So thank you all for inviting me to the conversation.
Amazing. Thanks, Kay. Jonathan, let's hear from you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan Guskiski, and here's what I'm going to say about this. Because you noticed my last name, it's a tricky one, and everyone's doing a valiant job. I appreciate it, but the reason it's tricky is because it's Finnish. And so what I was going to say is actually, the way I ended up doing what I'm doing now, and actually ended up at Michigan, is tied to the fact that I actually grew up in a family of artists. My grandparents are Finnish artists who, after the Second World War, like most Finnish people at that time, were very poor, and were actually literally like, my grandfather was an actor, and my grandmother was just a seamstress, and they actually created some handicrafts, and that turned actually into the first troll dolls that were ever created and sold, and that's a whole nother story. But they basically created an entire sort of not just a set of dolls, but a sort of little empire in Finland in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, and that ended up kind of dissolving later on. But I grew up in the cottage industry aftermath, so you can imagine a house with a little apartment upstairs with a family and a grandmother and an aunt all in the same place, and downstairs a factory and a store. And so what we've just heard about today that Emily shared so sort of cogently, I think, is such a true, I just want to start by saying I think it's such a true reality. And it's the fact that a lot of what we do when we study our art is sort of divorced from the realities of making our art. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to explore that. But the reality is that the way I ended up doing in this work is after wanting to become a pianist and going to school and doing all of those things, I kind of connected with a bunch of students about 15 years ago who were thinking about a lot of the same things, though not maybe as sophisticatedly as this group of artists is now, around connecting business and arts to empower people over their futures. And that actually ended up, transforming some other initiatives on campus. And one of them was at Michigan. And 15 years later, there was an opportunity to come, or 12 years later, to come here and work in a more formal way in this space, which is really to empower artists through professional development, training, and resources, and entrepreneurship and leadership as well. So that's why I'm here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to connect with you all.
And if we have time, we're going to hear that Troll Dolls story. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Maurice.
Hi, everyone. Very glad to be here. My musical journey. So my musical journey actually starts as a child, but I won't give you the whole life story. I grew up in an Air Force family, and I started learning piano when I was very young, probably 7 years old. And then fast forward 7 years later, by the time I was 14, we were living in Germany. I had a piano instructor, we'll never forget her name, Ellen Fetters. And she was a classical piano instructor, and she kicked me out of piano lessons. I had a habit of improvising on classical music, but she didn't just kick me out. She had a sidebar with my dad and said, I think he should start playing professionally. She was really sort of impressed with kind of what I was doing, even though it wasn't quite always what was on the page. And so I did. I got my first professional job as a pianist at the age of 14, working for the Department of Defense Chapel Services in Spangdahlem, Germany. Did that for a couple of years. And that experience stuck with me even as I grew up, and then graduated from high school and started went into college. First, I started out in engineering and very quickly realized that kind of wasn't where my passion was. I changed course. Along the way, somewhere in that story, I had started experimenting with synthesizers and electronic music. So I switched to electronic media. And then shortly after that, started working in a recording studio. And that recording studio opportunity led to an opportunity with an independent label that had a division in both Cincinnati, Ohio, and in New York. I was living in Cincinnati at the time, Lagosa Records and Sound Studios. And the rest was kind of history there. I took a quick sort of hard left. I realized that the things that I was studying in school were also the things that at that point I was doing to pay my rent. So I was writing background music for film and television shows. I was doing production work for major and independent labels, as well as helping support the administrative side of the business in artist management and music licensing. So really getting a rare opportunity to get a taste of both sides of the industry that I was interested in working in. I realized though, kind of as I got deeper and deeper, I worked almost a decade in that role. And as I got deeper and deeper into it, that there were a lot of sacrifices. I really appreciated the story that you shared, Emily, about your experience, making a living as an artist. And I realized at a certain point that in order to make a living as an artist, I would be giving up kind of a piece of myself that I wasn't ready to sacrifice. I think now I would call it equity, but equity in a much broader sense, not just the financial equity, but, in many ways, just taking on projects creatively that I just wasn't really, that my heart wasn't really into. And so I started exploring other paths that might alleviate the pressure of earning a living specifically as an artist. So this is where, kind of leading up into today, I forayed into traditional marketing communications, corporate marketing communications, all while working, continuing to work as an artist. Fast forward to today, working in a truer sort of arts administration role here at Yale University, while at the same time continuing to work as an artist, but with a really sort of a refocused vision on kind of creating a landscape for myself and for other artists that does create that kind of equity in the broader sense so that they can reap the benefits of their work. So that's kind of my story.
Fabulous. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to let Edwin kick it off with our first question. Oh, maybe we'll not, because Edwin is stuck. All right, I'm going to kick it off with our first question. I'm broadly interested in what success looks like for your programs. You know, like you're all attached to these incredible institutions. Albert, obviously, like we have, you know, we have history with Yale School of Music. Jonathan, you're with Michigan. Kay, you're with Peabody. Maurice, you're with the Schwartzman Center. And so like there is this cultivated vision of success. And so I would love to lay a foundation of what that looks like in a traditional sense at your institution. And then we'll get into like how you are counseling in alternative pathways. Also, yeah, I think that maybe people are having trouble unmuting.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I made people co-host, but for some reason they lose that status, and I don't really know why that's happening.
Maybe you can only make a limited number of people co-host, if that makes sense, perhaps.
I'm going to allow everyone to unmute themselves, so you can just do that. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Cool.
Did you want me to take that, Francis? Or
Yeah. Yeah.
Please jump
Let's
in.
start us off.
Oh, sure. So when I think about your question, I think three words come to mind. For me, the first word is qualitative. So when I think of success measures here at the Schwarzman Center and the engagement that I have with, say, our students, our student staff that come through the center, I think of qualitative success measures in terms of engagement and exploration. The idea that, you know, even for example, in the student, you know, opportunities that we provide here, student employment opportunities for the roles that roll up to me, I am looking for students who are interested in these non-traditional, very arts-focused roles like video editing, audio recording, graphic design, just an opportunity to really explore, but also looking at how they perhaps can link those artistic explorations into really practical uses for the organization. So, you know, when we think about art, oftentimes we think about this idea of it just being purely aesthetic. So my question is there a way to take this aesthetic and develop it into something that is also quite practical?
Yeah, Kay, Jonathan, would you like to speak?
Yeah, sure. I can go next. So before I came into the room, I also, like I said, I'm new at Peabody. So I also pitched some of this to our colleagues. So when you hear me answer, some of these answers are also from our colleagues, right, in the Launchpad office. So I sit in the Office of Community Engagement, and I also sit in our Launchpad services, career services kind of arm of Peabody. And what we've been doing, so folks understand, Peabody has developed a breakthrough curriculum which all students have to touch before they leave the school. So I am new to Peabody, so some of these things that you're hearing, like I said, is from my colleagues in the Launchpad offices, which is the career services wing of our office. And we also have the breakthrough curriculum that every Peabody student has to touch before they leave Peabody, the different iterations in freshman year, and then also in their junior and senior year, and also for new graduate students, they come in and they get certain courses. So our hope is that students are empowered to explore and connect and experience opportunities regardless of any social, financial, or geographic constraints. We work with our students, like you heard, I'm the manager of community partnerships. So we work with our students to develop access to resources within the community and have connections to different people. And we want them to develop the ability to evolve and create opportunities for themselves, as well as use their artistic training in a multitude of capacities and find ways to apply and transfer those skills, as Maurice mentioned, that they develop on the stage and in the rehearsal room for a variety of settings. One good thing that we get to do in teaching, as you heard, I'm also a faculty lecturer. So inside of my job, I also then teach and coach some of the students. What we're having discussions with them about what their interests are, what different opportunities, or what we even see them doing that could turn into something like that. And we connect how we measure it to, in addition to the normal ways, is that we've created these opportunities for students while they are on campus and alumni to document their evolution through writing and connection with us, conversations. We have something called the Creative Wire and the Max Q podcast, where the students and alumni speak about their chosen pathways that they did go off of, oftentimes, you know, being orchestral musicians or dancers or different things, where they may have continued and had struggles and sometimes pivoted along the way. And that becomes information for our students, the new students that come in to make decisions and think about the longevity of their career and have more planning for the long term.
Jonathan, do you want to jump in?
Sure, and I'll be brief. I mean, I think so. And I'm just also want to say I'm grateful to have the chance to connect with all the other panelists here. I'm looking forward to staying in touch. I think there's a lot of kindred, you know, connectivity across all of the work that we do. You know, in our office or our, you know, department, we're really a service center for the entire school. So I would say for us, you know, our mission is to provide the resources so that every student leaving the School of Music, Theater, and Dance feels equipped to build and sustain a career in the arts. It means lots of different things. You know, we have like 17 departments. You know, we're not just music, theater, musical theater, dance, undergrad to graduate, you know, doctoral degrees, 45 variations of the bachelor's degree. So in some ways it's very divergent. I will say that I think that there's something that hopefully we'll get to, which is there's a difference between kind of like the aspirational goals of some of the things that we're trying to do perhaps through our various offices and some of the stereotypes or tropes that persist within various other areas of the school. And what's interesting is I don't think those are often expressed. Like, I think if you were to talk to any given person in any department, they, you know, we feel really symbiotic and, you know, on the same page, culturally speaking, with the rest of the school. But I think that part of what you're getting to is how does the institution and the people within the institution, how do they define success? And to what degree does that connect with some of the aspirations we're talking about? So I'll leave it there. I think that that's a really interesting thing to probe further.
Albert, we'd love to hear about your work at Yale School of Music.
Sure. So here's how I'll answer that question. I think obviously success is a little different for everyone. That in some respects is kind of what Maurice was talking about with this sort of qualitative approach to things. I sort of approach it this way with the students that I work with, and as specifically as director of student life, career strategies falls under my portfolio as well. And as we're building that out, I'm using the tools that I used to build my own career as sort of governing principles in sharing and mentoring and counseling students. And fundamental to my career success was an understanding of a proverb that was shared with me when I was finishing undergrad and about to start my master's. And it was simply that my gift would make room for me and bring me before great people. And so I was working with a student just a few weeks ago who is about to graduate, and she's unsure, and we sat down and we literally I had her make a list, we didn't do it together, of all of her different areas of interest in music and beyond, and then to begin sort of exploring for herself what of these interests continues to lie dormant. And just in investing in her own curiosities, she has found a new interest in music, because in some way she realized it's not all. And that feeling like if it's not this, then I'm done, is really, really hard. You know, I mean, I did not set out to do, you know, equity work. I certainly didn't set out to do student service work in any way. This was not my path, but I think my own gift of empathy and my commitment to music as a career has led me here. And so I try to share with students all the time that if you can actually commit to you and trust just the process of life, the solutions, the career, the opportunities, they emerge out of that. And so it's a little, you know, it's a little esoteric and it's a little, you know, maybe hocus pocus, but I think for artists, it is crucially important for us to actually be in touch with our own hearts and for us to actually be in touch with all of what makes us tick if we want to actually breathe life into the music that we perform.
What I'm hearing, oh, sorry, Edwin, I don't mean to jump in. but I am. What I'm hearing is actually, you know, these prescribed paths that we think about that are associated with institutions, y'all are actively encouraging students to think more broadly than that. So that's incredible. Because I feel like, you know, it's changed maybe a little bit since I was at Peabody, or since, you know, even in the last couple of years at the Yale School of Music under your leadership. Talk to me a little bit about how students come to you and they start to think about their careers in these like untraditional paths. Like, what are their relationships to entrepreneurship, and how do you start to guide them through these questions about business development and even equity? Jonathan's not. I'm gonna go with Jonathan.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I would say, of course, there has to be some variance, right? Depending on what the student, where they are. I think meeting them, I just love that. That framing of empathy, Albert, that you just said so beautifully. That's so key to doing any of this kind of work. And I also appreciate the intersectionality, right? Of thinking about not just what you want to achieve, but why that should matter to the world and what good can you do. And so one thing, I'll just give you an example that, you know, there's a presumption actually, I think, at any kind of performing arts school that maybe students are going to come in with a very focused kind of personal goal. Like, I just want this thing for me. And it's sort of abstract. Like, I want to be in a symphony orchestra for the sake of that. But we did an experiment. So one thing that we do is we do orientations with all incoming students, and to see whether that holds water or not. And what's interesting, over the last 6 or 7 years now, we've done this with every incoming class of 200 some students. And we ask them 2 questions. We say, what's one big thing you want to do, you know, in your life in the arts? And like an achievement or something you want to go, you know, you're going for. And the second question is, what do you think is the biggest barrier in your path now that you're starting your college career? And you know, it's interesting, we've only had a handful, it would be less than like 2% of students say something abstract, like, I just want to be in a symphony orchestra. Most of these young people are saying, I really care about performance or whatever that thing is, but, you know, I'm also interested in figuring out how it connects to something else. And so I think, you know, meeting that we have to, at least this is the way I think about it, meet them with the kind of sense of respect and empathy, and also aspiration for those things that they really care about, and then help guide them towards whatever kind of structure might help them. For some people, it's starting a project. Others come in, you know, they already have maybe a business that they're kind of operating in an informal way, and help them find the right structure that'll actually actualize the impact, the thing that they care about. Because if we divorce it from that drive and that sort of sense of meaning, Albert, as you said, I think then we end up steering students towards these sort of prescribed tubes they feel like they're supposed to do for some sort of external approval. So that's how we think about it at Michigan in some, but I'd love to hear what others have to say.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think building off of you and Albert, I think 3 words, I just wrote down the words in my head that just came to mind: exposure, immersion, and mentorship. It's kind of, for me, and this is like a personal thing for me. For instance, when I went into Berklee, when I got to Berklee College of Music, I kind of had an interest in music supervision, and I did not know that it had a title, like that job had a title. Had somebody exposed that to me before I got to that college, I would have known a little bit more about that pathway being there for me. So what we do at Peabody with the breakthrough curriculum, the freshmen or the first years, they come in and they get exposure to all the kinds of arts careers. We have people, we encourage different people to come in and talk to them in classes, expose them to all the things that are out there. And then as they're developing on the musical side, or the artistic side, they're excelling at their careers, we find some ways to immerse them. And this is where we're talking about these connections to community. So as they're in Baltimore, I think about my own path as a student. When I moved to Boston, I immersed myself in that community for 4 years while I was there, right? So as these kids are coming here, you want to immerse them in Baltimore and find them some mentors and some opportunities that they can kind of explore, and have room for failure, and have room for deciding that that's not what they want to do, as Maurice said earlier, right? And figure out how they can pivot and actually ask us questions about that before we kind of just send them off into the world. And then also just building that opportunity in that lane of the Career Services Office Launchpad is open to them even as they are going out, and afterwards as their alumni, that they can come back to us and still have those connections, and maybe we can find mentors and different things in various parts of the industry for them to connect with, and maybe they just didn't have that before. So kind of looking at meeting them where they are, and then thinking creatively about, hey, like I have a student that wants to do interdisciplinary things. Like right now I'm thinking about, I know some colleagues over at MICA, like even outside of the bubble, the Peabody bubble, but MICA is around the corner, and they may have some things that they can talk to other students, because those networking and those connections that you make in your, teens and 20s last you for the rest of your kind of career, and can present different opportunities to you just because you're at the top of mind because you were somebody's roommate. So those are things that the students kind of haven't experienced yet, and then kind of walking them through that, even though they come in with blinders on, because in middle school this is kind of where they were forced to have, they had to perform and perform in these traditional ways. Now that they've gotten to their developing who they are career, kind of balancing that out for them is where our office kind of lies in that.
Yeah, one of my favorite things as an alum of Peabody that Peabody did was help that transition of the student into, their next thing. And sometimes that's in the arts and sometimes it's not, right? Albert.
To that end, I kind of have a quick tangential question. I've been kind of thinking about can you speak to some common traits that artists traditionally have that lend themselves so well to being any kind of innovator or entrepreneur as they begin to think about how their existing talents already transition so beautifully into other fields of work?
I think I'll just jump in. I think most artists, by the nature of what we do, are collaborative. I think most are collaborative. Soloists notwithstanding, I think even the instruments that we think of as being, major pianists come to mind, organists come to mind. I think even still we are brought up being collaborative, and we are used to hearing criticism, and we're used to responding to feedback in a positive and proactive way. So, I think a musician's ability to learn and to grow, the capacity is always there for us, because there's never a moment in our lives as musicians where we're sort of allowed to just be and do our own thing. We're always interfacing in some way. So that, to me, that's the biggest one.
I'm thinking more about the entrepreneurial aspect, and I'm thinking high risk tolerance and a grounding force. Those are like the two things that come to mind for me. So, first of all, this high risk tolerance to be able to go and do this thing that may or may not, succeed. And then this grounding force, because I think as artists, we naturally have this tendency to have these big, wonderful visions, these big visions that are sometimes quite aspirational and could be, potentially ruinous. It's good to have that person that supports you. It could be your network, it could be another person, it could be that thing inside that voice inside yourself that also operates as a grounding force that helps you to understand kind of where the boundaries maybe need to be in order for you to succeed.
Totally. So artists kind of naturally are inclined to step into this role of entrepreneur. They're self-starters. They have pretty high risk tolerance. Some of
the risk tolerance was pretty big. That's a good point. Yeah, that's a big point.
The stat that everyone loves to throw around is that 1 in 10 startups succeed, but most artists would kill for that stat, right? To be paid for what they want to do. Yeah. So this panel has already been quite spicy, and I'm dying to get into these questions of equity and of finance and of the potential for production. So I wanted to, kick it off, because we've talked about these two versions of equity in Emily's fabulous lecture. You've got the fairness, and then you've got ownership. well, can you talk about maybe how we can marry those two definitions so that we're not so, we're not completely living out the investment and the business definition of equity? I know this is imagining like your students beyond your academic institutions and into their professional lives, but I am fascinated about what y'all have to say about this.
So I'll jump in. I've spent so much of my professional life honing my craft, and creating pathways for myself to performance. And once I entered the academic spaces toward tenure and that sort of thing. So I will say that I have adored the time that I have been able to spend with Frances and exploring this particular idea, because it's reoriented my thinking in this business-centric way. I will say, as someone who specifically does DEI work in art, in music spaces, that one of the things I am always working with is that other piece of equity when I'm working with students, especially students who come from underrepresented and historically marginalized populations, about helping them own themselves, and it's owning yourself as the product, owning yourself as the idea, owning yourself as the worthy entity in this larger, broader space. And I can say for me, I was raised to follow directions, and I was raised to be a good student. And so that process for me was very, very, very hard. And for many of our students for whom discipline has been their biggest driver, they get their practicing done, they're on top of all of their things, developing their ability to own their own opinion about something is somewhat challenging. And so to students who are having challenges in that area, to me, this is that equity work in that way, which isn't about the system being equitable, but about me seeing myself as much a part of the whole as anybody else, and not allowing students to limit themselves based on other markers. So I'll leave the rest of the equity talk to everyone else.
I just wanted to follow up on that because I think you're so spot on. And I do actually think that sometimes it has economic implications, like it's hard to lash out at the person giving you a check, right? Like that takes a lot of gumption and a lot of diplomacy.
And it's much easier to do when you know you don't need the check.
Yes.
And yeah, exactly. Coming from family wealth kind of changes everything. It's like a strong possible indicator of a success in an artistic field already. And at that point, then comes the conversation, how do we ensure that underrepresented people are resourced in a complete way?
Yeah.
I would add to the conversation, as Albert was saying, I think about myself. So there's a bunch of kind of intersectional things I think about with myself. I'm an immigrant, I'm Black, I'm female. There's like, there's so much framing. And so when you put up the word equity or fairness or different things like that, a lot of this comes down to speaking to people in a language that they understand how to translate. People might use code switching, right? If we're talking to international students or anybody else that's coming into this system of trying to be in this artistic economic framework in America and different things like that, you have to unpack so that they get to the information, so then they can use the information. And that goes for, if we were just talking about in America in general, the communities themselves. I think Albert said it beautifully, is like helping them to understand what they already have, what they already own within the community. Because in truth, in fact, we say under-resourced as compared to someone else. But historically, if we go back into some of these communities of different backgrounds, you see that there is a system in which the economy flows throughout the community. And so it's trying to take that model and now translate it into a different space. When we're coming into this artistic space, everything is exploited. I mean, I'm going to use the word exploit. You exploit your music to make yourself money. Somebody exploits, you exploit the IP to do different things. Everything has a transactional equivalent, right? So it's trying to get people to understand or mirror, I think, which is really important. What we do with the students is kind of showing them where that shows up in their lives right now, because you might not be able to understand it. It will seem overwhelming if you try to look all the way out in the industry and try to grapple with that, but showing them the smaller things where it shows up right now. So for instance, at Peabody, we have granting things that we do at the school, right? You're gonna have to interact with this after you leave school. But right now you can apply for this $500 grant, micro grant, to build your website. This is the first time you start to introduce. It's kind of like when we were learning languages when we were babies, right? You're starting to integrate this into their normal thinking. And that goes, I mean, this is a longer conversation, but that goes down to financial literacy starting to happen when students are way younger, when they're, really young at home and different things. So when is it that we expose them to kind of talking the same language across barriers?
I think that's such a good point. And I wanted to actually kick this over to Maurice, who has obviously his background in communications, but also a doctorate in leadership studies. About how do you take what Kay is talking about and then implement it on a systemic level so that we can start to work towards systemic change?
Yeah, wow. So a lot to unpack here though. Yeah, because I was reflecting on a lot of this while you were speaking, and really reflecting on my own personal background. So Francis, you just mentioned my background in leadership studies. A lot of people just assume that I have a background, that my academic background is in art or is in music or in whatever, but actually as part of my own personal, growth, I, while working as an artist, while working in marketing communications, realized that an education in specifically in leadership studies, so in organizational leadership, and then further on, getting my doctorate in ethical and creative leadership, was a very intentional choice to actually support my practice as an artist, especially around in the area of personal level leadership. Everybody's heard that saying that you can't lead others until you learn to lead yourself. And so I think that there is a measure of that, at the risk of sounding simplistic or reductive. I just feel like there has to be a lot of intention or focus placed on the sort of the personal level leadership that goes into understanding yourself and what it is that you have to offer, what it is that in fact you own artistically, or in terms of equity, what it is that you already own, so that you can explore and exploit those to the proper ends, if that makes sense.
I wanted to sort of take a step back and think about the title of our presentation, which is Recasting Artist as an Entrepreneur. And from that perspective, I'd love to get into just a little bit the weeds of that exact thing about what that means, but also if there is an artist who is interested just fundamentally in doing that, where do you think they should begin? Is it finding what it is that they want to create, or is it finding community? Is it finding access of resources? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I have a couple of thoughts just responding to that, but also based on what's been shared already. So I want to say a couple of things, and I hope this is this is definitely on topic, but you can keep me honest. So I would say two things. I think the first thing, because what we're talking about now is sort of this, connection between, or this identification that we're trying to do in partnership with another person around who they are. So the first thing I would actually say from an entrepreneurship standpoint is to avoid any sense. So we talked about what are the traits and so forth of an artist. I think we need to understand, some commonalities between artists, entrepreneurs, but I don't think we should be focused on any kind of sense of trade-based entrepreneurship. I think what we approach it through the lens of is a methodology. And, Heidi Neck and Patricia Green at Babson have done a lot of work on this, which I think is essential. What that means is basically we can actually reframe what it means to be entrepreneurial, and has nothing to do with a prescribed identity, but rather a set of things that we can all learn to do. And that actually can help us strip away the pressure to be successful in one particular way. In entrepreneurship, that tends to be the person that scales up a new venture and creates a lot of wealth. Now, we're talking about using that in the arts. We have to do that. But most people who don't already see themselves as enterprising are going to say, that's not for me. That's not who I am. I think we have to take a step back to the first layer of all of this in terms of our interaction, which is to say, no, it doesn't really matter whether you've ever done a budget or not. What do you want to do? So I think it comes down to that level, and it's actualizing those things that they want to do that they never maybe expressed because they weren't supported or they didn't feel like they could express those things. I just feel like that goes back to what you were saying, Albert, about helping them own themselves and what they have to say. And when they do that, at least in Michigan, they have incredible ideas, incredible projects that they just never wanted to share. So part of it is then helping them do stuff. Do stuff is our informal motto. But of course, what we're really trying to do is help them do stuff with intentionality. And I think, as Maurice was saying, that is actually what it means to move that up that ladder towards leadership, because they also might say, I don't feel like a leader, and not everybody needs to be a leader, even though at Michigan, we're all leaders and best, as everybody should know. The reality, right, is simply that we want them to start to feel over time that earned sense of capacity. And so I think that's I'll leave it there because I'm sure others have lots to say, but that's for me the most essential way that we can actually circumvent the whole problem of translating artist to entrepreneur in that way. It doesn't mean that it's equally easy for everyone, but it levels the playing field and it gets us away from people feeling that we even have to translate who they are into something else. So.
I just wanted to share one quick anecdote about, starting Midnight Oil's entrepreneurship journey. Is that when we started this whole endeavor towards creating equitable opportunities in the arts, our question to our School of Management friend was essentially, win business, how money? We were so unable to speak the language of business, but we could so acutely define the problem that we were seeing, and that was profoundly affecting us. And I think that's what you're pointing to, Jonathan, which is that students have incredible ideas, they're world-changing ideas, right? And they're ideas that, regardless of financial implication, have a lot of value. And it also goes back to what Kay was saying. It's about, I think, meeting the student where it is and validating that they're seeing something that's real. And all you have to do is learn the language along the way. But that shouldn't slow you down or stop you from implementing.
Something I often try to just equip students with, is something that I grapple with in my own work, is acknowledging the things that we don't really like to talk about. And I don't think we always fully grapple what it means to be a member of an underrepresented population, historically marginalized population, in some of these elite artistic spaces. And to grapple with the level of fear and intimidation that can be so debilitating, even when it's not easily visible. And so, I hope as we are building these programs out, is that we're really helping students to really confront and be open about, and not necessarily with other people, but open with themselves about what it takes to make these steps. Because I think people are dealing with levels of anxiety and levels of frustration, and that they don't know how to grapple with them. And so they're turning around and walking away in many respects. And they don't recognize that some of the people who are successful are dealing with many of the same things, but we don't really talk about them. And so I think the deeply human pieces of this journey have to be front and center for us to get the tangible steps and processes to really to make our dreams come true.
Yeah, you are so spot on, Albert. Absolutely. I want to keep an eye on the clock because I would love to take a few questions. Now, based on the events of this panel thus far, I mean, I'm probably going to need to see your camera on for me to call on you as like the protective wife of the person attacked in the Zoom bombing. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And, you know, especially artists, like I would love to get artists into this space, especially those who are in the professional field grappling with these questions. Yes, Matt Hooper. Oh my gosh.
Can I unmute now? Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. My question, I was listening to some podcast the other day and they were mentioning how William Morris, you know, essentially started as a socialist. And I was thinking how complicated that legacy is now, to say the least, if you look at what William Morris is and does and how it's essentially a conglomerate. And Emily, as I wrote in the comments earlier, like what a great way to present the whole evening, right? And to really kind of frame the conversation about what ownership is. Given that it feels like any form of collective in the past ends up somehow becoming a hierarchical business, and whether that's good or bad, that has been the precedent set towards commercializing the arts more often than not. I won't say 100% of the time, but more often than not, particularly in the United States and Europe. My question then is, what happens when you're in the creative process and you start to feel that little bit of guilt, that little bit of shame, like, oh no, this is just a business endeavor, or maybe this has to be a business endeavor in a way I haven't done it? Because I think a lot of this work, and I've been on both sides of this conversation, obviously, as both the creator and as an entrepreneur, like they don't always make for the easiest bedfellows. And if this conversation is about reframing the journey of an artist, my simplest way of getting that question then is, how do you get yourself out of those very uncomfortable moments when you think, oh, business isn't really my forte, I'm not sure that I feel so comfortable with this, but I have to do it anyway? What are some practical guideposts and bits of advice for creators looking to be entrepreneurial for the first time?
Can I start us off by saying I was going to hop on to the end of that conversation. We have been encouraging our students. Number one, I would say we've done a lot of mission work, right? We expose them to what is your mission? And that goes to the core of Albert's question, like, what is it that you yourself are trying to impart on the world? What are you trying to leave on the world? What's the stamp? And if at any point in all the big businesses and the conversations we have in classes, we show them different sizes of businesses and individual people, individual creatives, and we're constantly reevaluating. We're checking if we're meeting that mark, right? And if it's not in the slightest bit where we want to go, that goes to, as Jonathan said in the chat, my thing about mentorship. I talk to students a lot about the types of coaching I've got on the way, to have a sounding board. Oftentimes we kind of just isolate ourselves and get to this process of like, I'm just checking myself, but you need to have people to talk with that have been through this before, that have gone through these type of changes, to give you the real ins and outs of what does that mean? When do you pivot? When do you give up and walk away? When do you hand it to other people? Can you collect a lot of people around you that are like-minded or will challenge you and will push you on those things when you are falling off the wagon, right? And tell you the truth so that you can get back on the rails of what your actual true mission is gonna be. Because at the end of the day, every business has to have and make some money. So that's what you're going into business for. But if you're like us, artists, service-based, or really trying to have some social impact and other implications, then you have to have a set of people around you that are going to keep you on track with that, so that you don't take that on yourself and feel like you're falling off. But then also, this is why we go into developing boards and all these, these other things, so that those people can check in with you and really give you the real about it. Are these things working? You should get focus groups. Are these things? And if you need to revamp things, as the orchestras are right now, if you need to revamp some things to make it actually fit your community or fit what you said you're going to do, then you pivot and you shift and you change that. So it's really getting a good sense of people around you and not really boxing yourself off and closing yourself off to that feedback and that criticism, right?
I just want to point out that like everyone referred to the notion of community, and how on some level finding that community either of peers or like people that can offer you support or people that can help you find your value or people that validate your worries about whatever you're feeling essentially is the solution to a lot of things, including what Matt was talking about. If a creator is feeling like they're selling out, what they need to do is talk to a community that feels that understands where they're at.
Totally. Lisa Moore, love to hear from you. We can't hear you quite yet. See if we can type it. Oh yeah, there we go.
Okay. Hi, this is really great. Thank you so much. I have learned a lot just sitting here. I'm pretty much a well established in my artistic field, which is new music, piano. I've kind of reached probably as far as I'm going to go in terms of concerts. And for me, the big thing is recording. And my issue is what a lot of you were talking about, and this is probably just a very practical question, and I should probably just find more people in my community who can help. But when with the only thing we can really own is recordings as performers, and yet the recording contracts with the new music recording companies are very bad for the performer, and the sales are bad too. So it's like, all right, I'll take your shitty deal because I know it's not going to be great, but I'll get more famous. Exactly what someone was saying before, you sell yourself to become more well known. Well, we sell ourselves by giving our stuff up for nothing to Spotify or to record companies. And I just wanted to know, like, how you get mentally around that problem of challenging a company that is full of nice people who may not even get your contract till the album is out. Actually, I'm in that situation right now, and it's all goodwill because we're in this really crappy business. And there doesn't seem to be anyone. I mean, they own the recordings. You get like, whatever it is, 2 cents per disc. So they're getting, I mean, anyway, that's the problem. I just find this a continuous problem. I have about 45 albums out there, and I get, just pittance every year in royalties. So.
Yeah, Lisa, so the first question that I would ask, because I get really passionate about this one, is how badly do you need the record company? There, I think about, I think about today what I tend to call the democratization of music, where there are so many platforms where artists can serve themselves, that there are really only very specific sort of things that labels really have the capacity to do beyond the individual, him or herself. And it could be that, with your previous experience with, the audience that you have built throughout the entirety of your career, that you could be making a larger share self-producing as opposed to relying on a label to do that for you. It could be that, it's you and a team that you've assembled as your own sort of independent production company, be it the publicist or the person who is managing your catalog. But there are ways that you can restructure it. In this day and age, folks aren't even buying physical copies anymore. So the distribution is primarily digital, and there are ways that in fact that you could restructure perhaps. If you ask yourself the question, how badly do you need that label? What do you need them for?
Well, one is on a lot of labels. I am, and in fact today I just put out an album on Bandcamp, which is one of these ones where you get all the stuff back. They just take a very small revenue, but again, it's like, yeah, so you have to hire 7 people to work for you in order to be successful, and I find that limiting too, because I can't think that way. I just don't think that way at all. To me, that's just beyond my psychic potential. I don't know, And obviously I'm white privileged and I still feel that way. I have tremendous lack of confidence in terms of like just going and saying, hey, you know, if I invest, then this will get me further.
I want to
Because-
challenge. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was going to say, I want to challenge that line of thinking that I don't think that way just a little bit, because this is where I'm going to give MOC some props. What I've really enjoyed about MOC's process is really teaching the artist how to think about their work in terms of business. So sitting down and literally plotting out your mission, vision, and values, understanding KPIs, and thinking about your work as an artist, your artistic creations in that way. And I believe that you might find that it's easier than you think, that there are a lot of natural connections, things that you're already thinking about as an artist, but haven't thought about, but haven't sort of translated those into business terminology that will then sort of lower that barrier, something that you feel is insurmountable or that labels have taught us we need them for exclusively, that, that can be done really successfully independently.
Also, I know that Maurice won't do it. I want to do a little plug of 5015, which is a record label that Maurice is creating and developing, exactly intended to upend the traditional record label model.
And Lisa, I just wanted to encourage you, like, I want to talk to you specifically about MOC and finding these disruptive pathways, because I think you're absolutely right. You are, I want to validate everything you said. Like, it's been terrible for us to figure out how to get our music out there, but we can come together as artists and create a system that works for us. It's just going to take a little bit of time and, like you said, community. Let's go with one more question. Gina?
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, okay. And now I can't hear you, but that's okay. So it's sort of a two-part question. And one is, and this is really in a different direction. One is really sort of abstract. I took a look at your website, and as I was sort of listening to this, and found a sort of pulled out a quote: art is an abstraction and good art is an even more abstract abstraction. And, you know, I thought maybe that's part of the issue, that many people view art as something that's really hard to measure, right? Because they see it as intangible. And so if we could somehow help shift that meaning so that people see art as something that is much more material and measurable. And for me it is, and here's where I get into the sort of second part of my question, which is more personal. So you all seem to be musicians and performers. I am a painter and a writer. I'm an amateur painter, right? And I always see ways in which I want to put my art out in the world and collaborate with other people. So for instance, I'm part of a group of artists, and everybody's been putting up sunflowers and Ukrainian flags, and it's really great. And I thought, gosh, I would love to curate a multimedia exhibit around refugees, not just Ukrainian refugees, but, you know, Syrian refugees, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, somebody even said, oh yeah, this is a great idea. Well, then I say, well, okay, there's the willpower, but I can't invest in this myself. Where's the support? And I think that's where you guys sort of come in. So I'm just going to leave that there and mute myself again. Thank you. And this has been great.
I'm so sorry about jumping in again. Yeah, we had a full conversation planned around equity versus investment versus grants. And like the specifics of how that will change based on what you wish to do with your project. But we're nearing the end and we can like talk offline about that perhaps. But I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts.
I'll just jump in quickly and think of, I like to think of it in a really specific way, so that I am separating myself in a sense, or remaining independent from the idea of me as a brand to be bought and sold. I find that personally destructive. And so what I would say is really the artist's life in some ways compartmentalizing the work of the art and the business of the art, so that I can do the business and put on that hat and work that angle without losing myself in it as if it's the thing, because it's actually just what we're doing to, one, earn a living, to two, distribute what it is that we do, but the other work is me. And so I have to do that. And I would encourage others who maybe in some ways feel like the business piece is something that they shy away from or uncomfortable with. Sometimes if you just sort of leave them separate and then I carve out time to do, to do these different works. Dear God, I have to do my taxes. I don't even want to think about it. But the necessary evil will get it done. But I am so big lately into making sure that we are building ourselves as humans, not as products.
And a big difference between the way that art works right now and business works is that, oftentimes the artist is commoditized. Like you sell yourself, you sell pieces of yourself, and that's exhausting. And so I think that creating practices that don't do that is a goal of the field. It should be a goal of the field. I wanted to very quickly give a shout out to Midnight Oil Collective, because Gina, if you have a great idea, if you have all of these artists that are surrounding your idea, you have your community built up, and it really only is, you don't know how the business works and you just need the financial component taken care of, come to us. That's in our entire mission is artist agency, artist equity, and building up the thing that you are willing to burn the midnight oil for, literally. So, and that goes for plays, that goes for music, that goes for screenplays, anything that is a creative venture, we support. We're at 6:30, but I wanted to give everyone 30 seconds just to wrap up and impart any last tidbits of wisdom about arts and equity that you have, or arts and entrepreneurship. Maybe we could start with, not to cold call anyone, Jonathan?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that comes to mind is a great question, and 30 seconds is tough, but I would say that one thing we can do is actually we can look out into the world and we can see examples. I'm really mulling on what Albert just said about this idea of being true to yourself and protecting yourself from the pressure to commodify who you are. I don't think that's healthy either. The first example that comes to mind is like Run the Jewels. Anybody know Run the Jewels, the hip hop duo? We've just been able to work with them in Michigan, the manager of Run the Jewels. And what's incredible is they started by giving their stuff away for free. I think they're a good example in kind of the commercial world of being in this space to really true to what they wanted to do as artists. And over time, they have built a very successful business empire, but their pathway, which of course has led to developing products and monetizing what they do, seems to eschew almost every like typical step that you would take. You would think you'd have to take to work in that world. And so I don't think we can mimic or copy anybody else, but that doesn't mean we can't look for inspiration. And so that's one thing I would say is I think Midnight Oil Collective is a vessel for doing that, right? It's for creating new knowledge, but also looking out into the world and thinking about how we can approach these things better. So that's my last thought. We should all do that.
Amazing. Kay, do you you typed something, but do you want to articulate what you've just put in the chat?
I was just adding to Jonathan's, like we've been talking to the students a lot about building and connecting with your community as the key. If people don't connect with you, that's it. Also with investors as well. You all talked about commodification, and Francis, to your point, I would say that you tend to commodify yourself when you're trying to fit into somebody else's bubble. There's way more people, there's billions of people on the earth that you don't have to fit in that box for. So don't chase down the dollar. Just because you need, it's hard to say that when people think you need it, but somebody else, that thing that you turn down that could be a no for you because it just doesn't go with your value could open you up to somebody else who's really interested in investing in you. And to that, I point to Edwin, you talked about, I was looking forward to that talk, but I'll just say to everyone, go watch, this is a plug for Marin Alsops, The Conductor, and really listen to her story about, she's told this story many times on the stage, but she told the story about her investor, Mr. Tomi Taki, who she named the Taki Alsop Fellowship over. And he was a client, but she talked to him about what she was really trying to do at a very pivotal point in her career. She needed to build an ensemble and nobody else was willing to invest in her. And just because he offered, he listened to her and he believed in what she had to say, she was able to do that, which got her to Leonard Bernstein and so on and so forth. And so, you know, those key things with people really believing in you and what you're trying to accomplish goes way more than you trying to commodify yourself or trying to fit this grant application just to fit the grant application.
I could not agree more. Maurice?
My closing tidbits of wisdom, my closing thoughts. I was actually reflecting on something that Jonathan had said earlier that sort of stood out to me about artists or musicians who don't think of themselves as leaders. And I actually have really strong feelings about that, because when I think about, think about all the academic studies and things that have been written about leaders and leadership and the qualities of leaders, we think of at least two responsibilities that leaders have. One is framing, making meaning of the world for themselves and for others. And then the other is this idea around social transformation. And if you think about the work that artists do, that is primarily the work that we do as artists as well. It's around framing, it's around social transformation. And so just by virtue, I would argue that by virtue of those two alone, if not more, qualities, that artists themselves are leaders, whether they realize it or not. And it behooves us all the more to sort of understand the power, the equity that the things that we already own, and how to live into those.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Maurice. And Dr. Lee, you want to round us out?
Sure. I guess I'll start by saying this. First and foremost, I'm really, really honored to be a part of this panel, to hear such incredible insights on things, and to offer my own tidbits around what I think. Ultimately, I think people are really looking for answers, and we're looking for ways to solve problems, and we're looking for outlets. And first and foremost, I will tell you that the answer that you're looking for is you. It's really that simple. You are the answer to all of this. And if we can collectively grapple with what it is that we have to offer and what it is that we are trying to put out in the world, and if we can do this together, I think we can start to turn the dial in a more progressive direction. So that people who feel like they want to disrupt spaces with nonsense, don't necessarily feel the need to come into this particular space because we're operating and doing something for our communities, for one another, and ultimately pouring forth from ourselves.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your beautiful words, your beautiful thought, and for creating this community where we are building towards the world that we want to be in.